which is Parshat CHUKAT. And tomorrow morning, I will be teaching on Parshat Balak. These two parshiot aren't normally combined. It only happens on a rare occasion when we're off track with Israel on the calendar because one of the holidays falls on Shabbat here because we're outside of Israel, and it doesn't fall on a holiday in Israel. So we're playing catch up to get back on track and be reading the same parsha with people inside of Israel. Last week, we learned about Parshat Korach, who led a rebellion against Moshe and Aaron, ostensibly because he was trying to tell them that we are all equal, we are all holy, therefore we should all be Kohen Gadol. But the truth is that he wanted the position for himself. So we're going to come across some of the same issues tomorrow morning with Parshat Balak. But in the meantime, I'm going to concentrate on Parshat CHUKAT. And CHUKAT is from Chukah or Chok, which means a decree. So with the t ending, it literally means decree of. The parsha starts out with the laws concerning the red heifer, purification laws, goes into great detail about that, especially purification when one comes in contact with a death. And then right after that, it goes into this story of Miriam dying, and there's no water, and the people once again complain. So it looks like we're taking up right where we left off with last week's complaints. So you may be surprised to know that actually 38 years have passed. So this is 38 years later. All of the people that decreed to die in the desert and not enter the land have died. And this is the successive generations, their children. So the complaints are very familiar, however, with some important differences. Instead of wishing that they had died in Egypt or in the wilderness, now they lament, if only we had perished as our brethren perished before Hashem, referring to that generation that God decreed would die in the desert. They complain about the food they miss once again, and finally that there's no water. And of course, the complaint about no water is an important complaint. This complaint is associated with Miriam, who's always associated with finding water for the people. And in fact, the two verses are side by side. Miriam died, and there was no water. Because of that, we first of all, we feel bad that Miriam has died, and there doesn't seem to be anyone mourning her death or even mentioning it. All they can think about is how it has affected them. So in this intervening 38 years, the Torah is silent about what's gone on. We can only guess. There's a lot of midrash built around what happened during the 38 years, but we're given no information in this parsha, and in fact, only very scant information later on in Sefer Devarim. In fact, in Sefer Devarim, here is what Moshe says about what happened during those 38 years. He says to the people, "You shall remember the entire road on which Hashem, your God, led you these 40 years in the wilderness, so as to afflict you, to test you, to know what is in your heart, whether you would observe his commandments or not." So apparently, this has been a test, not only about having sufficient time for the previous generation to die, but a test for the people that will go into the land to know what is in their heart. So the Torah makes it clear that all the physical needs of the Israelites have been completely taken care of. They've got manna for food, they've got water that's been provided by Miriam as well, and then after her death from the rock, as we'll learn. And their clothes and shoes do not wear out. The affliction that's mentioned in the passage I just read from Devarim seems to be self-inflicted. The test was a lack of faith. So in a sense, B'nai Israel has led a protected existence for almost all of the 40 years, similar to a fetus in the womb, with all their nourishment taken care of, protected by God, free from the cares of taking care of the daily concerns of life. This latest round of quarreling and complaining seemed to be the last straw for Moshe, however. As I said, Miriam has just died, and there's no mention of anyone mourning her or supporting Moshe and Aaron in their grief. The fact that there was no water was a real problem, and maybe that is why God does not react with anger directed to the people, in contrast to what we learned last week, that God was very angry with the people complaining. What God does do is God gives clear instructions to resolve the crisis. He says to Moshe, take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aaron, your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it shall give its waters. You shall bring forth for them water from the rock and give drink to the assembly and to their animals. Very specific instructions on how to solve the crisis. But perhaps because of his anger and his grief, Moshe does not completely obey God's command. He strikes the rock instead. He strikes the rock twice instead of speaking to it. For this seemingly minor offense, after 40 tireless and faithful years, Moshe and Aaron are told they will not bring B'nai Israel across the Jordan and into the land. So I cannot tell you the disappointment that I feel and that everybody feels every year when we read this. We're shocked and we all wish for a different outcome. So we try to figure out why. There are many reasons given why the scene played out the way it did. But what I first want to do is examine some of the important questions. So first of all, if Moshe was not supposed to strike the rock, why did God tell him to take the staff? Second, what about the absurdity of speaking to the rock, an inanimate object? Can a rock listen? What is that about? The next question I pose is, if Moshe disobeyed God by striking the rock rather than speaking to it, why did the strike produce abundant water, enough for the entire assembly and their animals to drink? And then finally, why was Aaron punished for what Moshe did? So these are just a few of the large questions I want to examine. I'm going to answer partially just the first one, and I'll leave the rest for tomorrow. So the first question was, if he was not supposed to strike the rock, why did God tell him to take the staff? This is really interesting. Dr. Aviva Zornberg, and you know I rely on her heavily for a lot of wonderful explanations and fleshing out of what may not be absolutely clear, and also her psychological insights into the whys and wherefores of human behavior vis-a-vis our narrations here. She provides some insight into the answers of all of these questions I pose, except for perhaps the one that I asked, which was, if Moshe wasn't supposed to strike the rock and did, why then did water come forth? Can't seem to find an answer from our sages for that. So maybe you guys can ponder that tonight, and whichever one of you has an idea about it, I'd love for you to share it with me tomorrow morning. So back to why God told Moshe to take the staff if he wasn't supposed to strike it, because remember, last time there was a water crisis, God told Moshe to take the staff and strike the rock, and that's how they got water in the crisis before this one. So Aviva Zornberg spends a lot of time talking about this staff, which she calls an instrument of violence. In fact, she recalls that the first time we meet a grown-up Moshe, we meet him in the midst of a violent action. If you'll remember, he goes out from the palace. This is his first time venturing out that we read about. in Torah, and he comes across an Egyptian taskmaster who was beating an Israelite slave. He witnesses this, and he kills the taskmaster, and then has to flee from Egypt. So we see him having an understanding that violence does solve some problems, but it doesn't mean that it solves all the problems, nor does it preclude an evolution towards nonviolent solutions. So for example, very often violence is needed in a particular situation, and that is an arrow in your quiver, let's say, a go-to solution for certain situations when nothing else will do. But if it's the only solution that you go to, no matter what the situation is, you'll learn that it's not an all-purpose answer, or it may take you to a certain point and enable you to overcome certain obstacles, but after that, it can really be a liability. So I think that's part of the reason of why God told Moshe to speak to the rock. That is, we're leaving this cycle of violence behind now. The people are maturing. This is a different generation. They've learned Torah for 38 years. Now I want you to show them the power of words to solve problems. So in last week's Parsha, after the staff of Levi was engraved with Aaron's name, as part of the 12 staffs that were the test to see who God had selected as the Kohen Gadol, you'll remember that Aaron's staff sprouted and flowered, and ripe almonds came from it. So there was an obvious sign that Aaron was the one that God had chosen to be Kohen Gadol. After this show, the results of this test, God told Moshe, bring back the staff of Aaron before the testimony as a safekeeping, as a sign for rebellious ones. Let their complaints cease from me, that they not die. So this is 38 years ago. God tells Moshe, take that staff, that miraculous staff, put it in the ark for safekeeping. And remember, the only other two things that we know from Torah that were in the ark was the second set of tablets and a jar of manna. So now, 38 years later, when God instructs Moshe to take the staff, I believe that he's telling Moshe to take that staff that was put in the ark for safekeeping, show it to the people, because they are being rebellious, that they stop their complaining and stop their rebellion. But Moshe forgets this. He forgets that that was the purpose of putting the staff in the ark for safekeeping. He forgets that now is a time for speech and not violence. Perhaps his anger and grief over the death of Miriam occluded his memory and clouded his judgment. We know, in fact, that grief and anger can cloud our judgment. In fact, there's even a midrash that when Moshe died, the people immediately forgot 200 laws. So we know that grief also affects memory. There's even another midrash that has the same basic facts, except the people forgot 2,000 laws. So both grief and fear have a profound effect on memory. So keep that in mind. Think about the other 3 questions that I pose, and we'll get to them tomorrow morning, as well as a very interesting discussion on Parshat Balak. And by way of introduction, just so you know, for those of you who aren't reading the Parsha, go ahead, you have time to read them both. But in case you don't, Parsha Balak is a unique Parsha in Torah. It's the narrative of a person who is not an Israelite. The point of view is completely different from the point of view of a foreign nation and a foreign king, and in fact, a king and a non-Jewish prophet who have hatred for the Jewish people. Nowhere else in Torah do we get this perspective. In fact, after Parshat Noach, all of our stories about our patriarchs, our matriarchs, and then Moshe and the Israelites leaving Egypt. So Moshe has been completely left out of most of this story, definitely the whole story involving Balak and Balaam. And every year I wonder what it's doing here. First of all, what's it doing in the Torah, and what's it doing after Parshat Korach? And this year I came up with a real interesting idea and explanation. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you guys tomorrow.